Today's lectionary text is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into the vineyard. When he went out at 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again at noon, at about 3 o'clock, he did the same thing. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired at about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now, when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last, who worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to these last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. I don't think there is a more American parable in all of the Gospels than today's lectionary text. For the most part, parables are constructed from the narrative materials of a world that is really foreign to us as 21st century Americans. But this parable seems like it could have been written just for us. It's a parable of the kingdom, the reign of God. It is not a go and do likewise parable, not a parable about how we should behave. It's a parable that contains a surplus of meaning about what life lived under the sovereignty of God is really like. The kingdom of God is like a landowner who needed day laborers to work in his vineyard. So he goes out at 6 a.m. to find a few workers waiting for a job, and he brings them back to the vineyard and promises them a day's wage for their work. Fair enough. Then he goes out again at 9 a.m. and brings back a few more workers out looking for a job that morning, and he puts them to work in the fields. This time, he doesn't say what he'll pay them. He just says he'll pay them what is right and just and fair. And these workers go to work beside the laborers who have been out there for 3 hours already. And then he goes out again at noon, and then he goes again at 3 p.m. and finds more workers each time just standing around the marketplace. And he brings them back and puts them to work beside those who have been there for 9 hours already. The story doesn't say why these laborers who are standing idle in the marketplace haven't been hired for a job that day. It's likely not because they didn't want to work, or else they'd be at home and not standing around the marketplace waiting to be hired. Maybe they were too scrawny, and other managers didn't think they could handle a hard day's labor. Maybe they were not the kind of people you would want working in your vineyards if you were a respectable vineyard owner. Maybe they just suffered for a lack of enough work to go around that day. Either way, the reign of God is like a vineyard owner who loads all of these day laborers up into the wagon and puts them to work into the fields. And then at 5 o'clock, he finds more laborers who still don't have any work. And he loads them up and he brings them to the vineyard and puts them to work beside those who have been working for 11 hours now. And about an hour later, the sun starts to set, and the vineyard owner needs to settle up with his day laborers. So he calls them into the shed, and he asks the manager to hand out the wages for the day. And the ones who came to work an hour ago are the first ones to be paid. And much to their surprise, they receive an entire day's wage for 1 hour of work. Then the ones who came to work at 3 got their money, and it was also an entire day's pay. And the others down the line were getting excited to see how much they would get. It must be more than they contracted for. So then the ones who arrived at 9 a.m. received their payment. And much to their surprise, it was a simple day's wage. And then the ones who had been at work in the vineyard for a full 12 hours in the hot sun of the Palestinian countryside got their money. And it was 1 day's wage. Exactly what they were promised that day at 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, a day's wage for a vineyard laborer in this era was a denarius, barely enough to maintain a family on a subsistence level. It was perhaps what we might consider the minimum wage, just enough to get by from one day to the next, and barely that. And with sweat dripping down their faces, the laborers who had been there all day long looked at their money, and they looked over at their co-laborers who had barely been there long enough to break a sweat. And they looked at the vineyard owner and they said, "What is this? These guys only worked for an hour and we've been sweating our butts off out here in the fields all day long, and you paid them the same wage you're paying us." And, says Jesus, this is what the kingdom of God is like. I want you to notice something important here. When those hired at 6 a.m. receive their pay, they don't object to the amount of their wages. They don't say, this is barely enough to get by. We should really organize and try to get a fairer wage for our labor. We're really being taken advantage of by these vineyard owners. We've got to get organized and unionize. And in this parable, nothing like that happens. We're not talking about a money-grubbing landowner who is notoriously unfair to his workers and gets a kick out of seeing them suffer. We're talking about day laborers who all know, every last one of them, what it means to work a hard day in the field so that they could provide for their family. All of them knew the financial hit it could be to lose a day of labor for no other reason than that you weren't hired that day. I want us to be clear about what's going on here in this parable. The working class laborers, just working hard all day long, doing their jobs, feeding their families. The people in the story you're supposed to identify with most are angry about the mercy shown to those they would rather see suffer. Their fellow workers suffering the scarcity of income to feed their families seemed more just to them than everyone going home with just enough. These are the ones who complain about the generosity of a landowner who believed that every worker deserved the dignity of a day's wage, even if they had the misfortune of not being picked up until the very end of the day. It was their fellow workers who said, hell no, they don't deserve what we got when we've been out here all day long. They received a day's wage, exactly what they had contracted for, and appear perfectly satisfied with it. however insufficient it was. What they object to is that the others who came on the job later in the day have been made equal to them. They received the same subsistence wage for less work. Those who were disadvantaged by a scarcity of work are still able to get by. Those who were passed over for the job because of physical insufficiency or gender or race or nationality or documentation status or whatever the case may be, were now on equal economic standing with those who were hired at the beginning of the day. And it's not fair. I mean, really, we can all see where they're coming from, can't we? Where's the fairness, the justice in working for 12 hours in the sweltering sun and getting paid no more than the workers who showed up just an hour before quitting time? Who wouldn't go complaining to the management about those kinds of labor practices? You can see their point, can't you? And maybe it helps us to see in this ancient mirror something of our own situation when it's not just those at the top of the power structures and systems of oppression who are working against fairness and justice and doing what is right, but it's also those who are harmed by the system that works to keep the system in place. It's also those who just had the good fortune of getting picked up at the first of the day, who then work against the interests of their fellow laborers who weren't as lucky as they were. It's not at all hard to see ourselves in this ancient text, is it? Now, the question of just who we identify with in this parable is an important one. If we read it as an allegory, we identify with the landowner who we presume to be God. And God's ways, God's justice, God's sense of fairness is always right. So we identify with the landowner and we just assume that everyone else in the parable has got something to learn. But parables aren't meant to be allegorized. We're not supposed to get off that easy when we read these stories. The landowner isn't God. The payment of wages isn't the final judgment. Instead, it is the parable as a whole, the entire story, that says something about what the kingdom of God is like. So then, when you look at this parable, where do you see yourself being pulled between life in the empire and life in the kingdom of God? Where can you feel that tension? Who did you first identify with when you read this ancient story? Who did you emotionally resonate with as you heard each set of characters react to the payment at the end of the day? Is it the landowner who keeps searching and seeking and trying to work for the dignity of others only to be scorned for believing that everyone deserves this compassion? Is it the laborers standing around the marketplace late into the day, wondering if they'll ever be chosen, given something worthwhile to do, able to feed their families that evening? Is it the hard workers who labor all day long, who are intent not to let mercy or generosity or compassion have the last word? Because there is being charitable, and then there is being gratuitously, recklessly, unjustly compassionate. And that's why it's such a perfect American parable, or at least a white American parable, or perhaps a parable for Americans of a certain economic status. If it's one thing we seem to enjoy as a society, it's to feel a certain kind of pleasure in not being in the shoes of those poor unfortunates who didn't get picked up and brought to work until the very end of the day. Maybe we can even charitably share some of our good fortune with them from time to time. After all, we're good and kind people. But everyone doesn't deserve the means of subsistence as a right: health care, income, housing, work. Is it out of our own privilege that we identify with those who are first hired, or even with the vineyard owner? And what does a liberative reading of this text require of us? To struggle to identify with the last hired, perhaps? But remember, this isn't a go and do likewise parable on ethical behavior or economic power structures. Otherwise, one of the workers would have pulled all the other workers into a place in the field and set them down around them and said, we need to really think about this thing here. So let me tell you about what it means for workers to seize the means of production. But that's not this parable. This is a parable about what the reign of God is like for those who presume they want to live within it. And according to the story, in the kingdom of God, everyone who gets left behind by the cruelty of the marketplace or by the happenstance of unfortunate circumstances or by being overlooked and undervalued, someone is coming for you. And they'll keep coming at 9 o'clock and at noon and at 3 o'clock and even up into the last hour. And any of us who live our lives within the kingdom, that reign, that dominion of God, may be the ones sent into the marketplace to find those who are still lingering there. And in the dominion of God, at the end of the day, when we're all tired from a hard day's labor, having really done something worthwhile, whether it was for an hour or for a whole day, we'll all go home with enough to live, having received this day our daily bread. Those are the economics of God's reign. And within that reign, some of those who are a part of this expansive kingdom will be envious over that generosity, angry over the unjust nature of compassion, maddened by the recklessness of grace. But the next day, as we're all in the marketplace once again, wondering if anyone is going to come for us today, when we see that old pickup from the vineyard drive up, we won't hesitate to jump into the back when someone motions for us. Because as crazy as it sounds, as reckless as it seems, as angry and envious as the whole thing might make us, where else would we rather be? And that is what the kingdom of God is like.